Ignis Fatuus. In a dark moonless night, while I was in my long vacation due to the pandemic, my brother have started narrating me a thrilling story about his high school. That school was way far from my neighbors. Back then we had no high schools nearby, only primary schools. My big brother had a lot of childhood friends next door. Most of parents in my hometown had tended to send their children to that high school, a prestigious school, which attracted a lot of talented kids from 100 miles away. So, the school administration had built a spacious dormitory so that kids could stay in to focus to their study. The idea of being free and stay away from home was a must-try experience to my brother. He had insisted my parent to move in and they had been convinced after a few days. He had been so much exciting right after he entered the room. Even after a long 40 minutes drive. Such a big place here, look at the outside, he talked out loud. There were 3 more kids as his roommates, they all were from a far east province 2 hours drive from there. The dormitory was just finished by that year, it was right at the bottom of the mountain. Once the windows was opened, they had breath taken by a huge and picturesque view of mountains and forests. There was a very strict rule in the dormitory, at 9 p.m., lights had to be all turned off. One night, it was nearly the curfew, one of my brother's roommates still was at his study desk and tried to finish his homework. "Hey Steve, curfew time, don't you go to bed?" Steve was the most hard-working student among them. "You guys go ahead, I have prepared my flashlight here, I'll reading a little more." After all of the lights had turned off, Steve has drowned to the night's silence with his book. But all of a sudden, my brother and the 2 others had been awakened by Steve's voice. "Guys, wake up, you gotta see this, there was something outside the window." "What's wrong with you, asshole? You know what time is it? Why too loud?" They were wondering why Steve was making that noise in the middle of the night while opening the windows. Steve had pointed out of the windows to show them something. The 3 guys had come towards the windows and thrown their eyes outside. They all had jaw dropped unspeakably because some mysterious blue flames were fading in and out in the forest nearby in front of their very eyes. "What the hell is that?" One of them too surprised to examine what was he watching. "That's ghost fire as known as Ignis Fatuus. Don't you know that?" My brother confidently answered. He have been growing with digging too much of those kind of spiritual, mysterious stories, so he was a professional compared to his roommates. "Why there are so much of blue flame?" They were worrying chat. "I heard there were lots of death bodies had been buried in that forest long time ago." One of them once heard from his homeroom teacher. Many people had seen those blue flames in dark night. "Don't tell me this dorm had been built in the surface of a cemetery. We probably were being ghost haunting." "Calm down. There had been a sacrifice of somethings in the past." My brother comforted them. Even though the fear were eating them, they all had decided to close the window, and ended up go to bed since it was pretty late. The next day, they had come to class and once again talked about what they had seen earlier to the other classmates. "Our room is way more creepier," a guy spoke up. He said that his roommates have heard whispers and treads at midnight. "Are you overeating? I'm telling the truth. I swear. Don't you guys see the strange last night?" My brother was a bit confused, but deep down he was still thinking about the blue flames the night before. After classes that day, the 4 of them sneaked out to check out the forest. They wanted to check out whether countless of tombs has been built there by their own eyes. "Look, are these bone?" Mike, one of them, had found some white pieces of bone and called the others. There were countless of white pieces of bones on the ground all over that place, which were likely to be from human. Here too, and here as well. The 4 of them suspected that those pieces of bone have been found from the dorm area at the time it has been built and tossed to the forest as the result probably. The more they thought of it, the more they have been scared. We gotta head back. Steve left first and seemed a bit paled. Wait for us. The four have rushed to get back as soon as possible. That was too scary for them. Accidentally, Steve had tripped and subsided in front of them. Steve, what is happening? Steve's body had more and more sinked down. They had screamed and run towards him. They had dragged Steve out of the hole. Right after Steve had been rescued, his legs had backed on the ground. He had cried, whining. Steve had found out he got a skull in his leg. How scary. He had immobilized, quivering and totally collapsed. What the hell? Why on earth is such a deep hole here? Mike said. His voice was way too shaking. Might be there was a grave in the past there. Or had been buried somethings and dug out already. Steve just too hurried to see it and got trapped in, my brother suspected calmly. The group of four hurried back to the dorm. They climbed over the gate and got back their room silently. That night, they went to bed earlier than usual. They had no guts to play cards. Steve hadn't wanted to study or read late neither. Daniel, wake up. While being deeply asleep, Mike's voice had wakened my brother. The others had been awakened as well. My brother had a bit annoyed. What? Suddenly, the silence of the night had been broken. There were whispers and footsteps outside. He had recalled and pulled his classmate's story in the morning up. Daniel, you are the bravest here. Open the window and check it out. My brother's roommates had hastened him. He had frightened to death, but with the thought he was the bravest, he had decided to try. He had nearly screamed aloud after he pulled the window curtain. He could see there were at least 5 people roaming very nearby, but it would be hard to reveal surely whether they are human. They were too blurry to be sure. My brother ran back to his bed without a word, and the four had pulled their blankets cover their heads to get over the night. A few days later, some students had reported this incident to the dorm's administration. As a result of that, the officers had bring an old watchdog and tied him at the dorm's gate to guard them. Guys, what happened to that watchdog? He keeps non-stop barking. I heard that dog is able to see those spiritual things. That dog is a real deal. He's immobilized all day, but raised his bark all night. How we can sleep? Hey Daniel, come with me to see what happened to the dog, please. Mike insisted. My brother. They'd straight up, came to the windows and pulled the curtain. They were seeing the watchdog were barking in pain, struggling with so much Ignis Fatuus around. He were barking more and more aloud. Those ghost fires had surrounded the watchdog a while before flying back to the forest behind the dorm's gate. The watchdog still kept barking afterwards, such a noise, but they had been comforted a bit. A week later, at midnight, my brother listened a door sound. There were likely someone pushed the door and stepped out. He had vaguely thought that someone had to go to the toilet, so he just returned to sleep. Where is Steve? Why he awake that early today? No ideas. I haven't seen him since I woke up. They had all no ideas where could Steve be that morning. His clothes are here. How he went out without getting dressed? They were wondering shortly. Steve's clothes were still in his bed. My brother recalled what happened last night suddenly. They all dressed up and hurried to the dorm's public toilet. What wrong? My brother have asked when he saw a guy who was standing in front of the toilet and staring inside. Such a right time. Your roommate has fainted inside, he replied. There were a crowd gathered. They had tried to come over the crowd, and seen Steve has propped up against the wall faintly. The other kids were trying to stir him up. He had still no response afterwards. His roommates had bring him to the dorm's medical center. After diagnostic, they had been notified that Steve had no serious health issues. He just too scared and blacked out. A while later, Steve finally opened his eye. His roommates asked what had happened. Steve have started to tell with a puzzled face. I have seen ghost with my own eye. Last night, He wanted to use the public toilet while everyone were sleeping, it was so dark. He stepped out of the room and hit someone in the toilet. He would like to say sorry. But when he gazed up, he faced up, he had seen an unforgettable, rotten face so clearly with an extremely tall body in front of him. Steve have frightened badly and backed up, but lost his balance and fell down unspeakably. He felt that he hit the wall probably and then wake up in the medical center. After that, Steve had quit school and back to his hometown. My brother also thought of backing home, but the other's 2 roommates had convinced him to stay. The night later, while my brother was sleeping, once again he had been awakened by the watchdog. This time, there were not only intensely barking, also weirdly whimpering. The watchdog kept barking and groaning for a while, so they had to come to the window and pull the curtain. The watchdog was surrounded by so much of Ignis Fatuus. Those were more and more attacking to the dog, but from afar they were unable to see what happened clearly. Seemed like the watchdog has fought back and whimpered more and more badly. Finally, the watchdog had laid up with his 4 legs uplifted. They were watching the watchdog were dying. One of them asked, "What the hell just happened?" No one answered, no one moved out of their beds. They have let the lights on regardless the curfew and stayed up all night. In the next morning, an officer had come to check why the watchdog had died. The 3 in the room had been in panic since they have been eyewitnesses how the watchdog died the night before. After careful checks, the dorm's administration couldn't find out the reason of the watchdog death. There were no injuries in his body. Some kids reported that they had heard the watchdog's barks aloud, but had no guts to check outside in the dark. Some kids couldn't hear anything. My brother and his roommates had reported what they had seen honestly. After then, my brother moved back home. Afar-living students had rather chosen to rent houses from the neighborhood than lived in the dorm's property. Day after day, there were no one left and the dorm had been closed forever. A few years later, I had a chance to walk by that dorm. It had been abandoned for years, so it looked murky. I have heard once again the story about Ignis Fatuus from the local.